The city was never truly dark. Even at midnight, the air above Chicago shimmered faintly with the red haze of furnace smoke and the dim, buzzing glow of gas lamps along the streets. The skyline looked like a forest of blackened chimneys, each one breathing, sighing, exhaling a ghost into the sky. Somewhere, far below that smoke, a man was walking home through the smell of rain, whiskey, and coal dust. In those years, Chicago was a city built on contradictions. By day, it hummed with industry, railroads, slaughterhouses, factories, a place of noise and ambition. By night, it became something else, a warren of jazz, liquor, and quiet deals whispered behind closed doors. The newspapers called it the City of Broad Shoulders, but for most who lived there, it was simply home, with all the exhaustion that word carried. The year was 1925. Prohibition was in full swing. Alcohol was illegal, but its scent drifted through every alley and apartment like a forbidden perfume. From the river to Cicero, men worked under false names, shipping crates labeled medicine and fruit syrup that clinked suspiciously when carried. The city was learning how to lie, gracefully, profitably, without shame. And above all that, like the conductor of a silent orchestra, there was Alphonse Capone. To most, he was invisible, a rumor, a story told in saloons. Only a few had seen him in person, driving past in a Cadillac with the windows half down, cigar smoke spilling into the street. They said he was polite, even charming, that he tipped cab drivers too much, that he loved opera. But behind that easy smile, Chicago's empire of blood and whiskey took shape, one handshake at a time. If you stood near the Lexington Hotel in Southside Chicago, his headquarters, you could feel it. Not see it, but feel it. The air carried a kind of stillness, the quiet hum of wealth and danger. The doormen were polite, but their eyes were watchful. Men in hats lingered at corners, pretending to read newspapers that never turned a page. It was not the violence itself that frightened the city. It was the silence before it. Chicago was not only Capone's city. It was a machine that consumed people and stories, immigrants, dreamers, children who grew up under the sound of sirens and jazz. It was built by hands from Italy, Ireland, Poland, and the Deep South, all chasing something that shimmered just out of reach. For many, Capone wasn't a monster. He was proof that the system could be beaten, that someone from the gutters could rule the throne. And yet, if you wandered far enough from the city center, past the bars and the smoke, you'd find something quieter. A mother washing clothes in a bucket on her porch. A boy walking home barefoot after shining shoes. A priest locking the church doors before nightfall. Life went on in small, fragile rhythms, pretending not to hear the thunder downtown. History often remembers Capone as a man of violence. But what if the story began differently? What if, before the empire, there was only a young man trying to belong in a city that did not care who you were unless you could make noise? Before the headlines, before the fear, there was a boy from Brooklyn, the son of immigrants, standing at the edge of Chicago's skyline, breathing its smoke for the first time. He was 20 when he first arrived, full of raw energy, his accent thick, his manners rough but eager. He found work as a bouncer, a driver, a hired muscle, whatever paid. The city, in return, gave him lessons. That power was not inherited, but taken, and that fear could be as valuable as money. He learned quickly. Chicago rewarded those who adapted to its rhythm, those who knew when to smile and when to pull the trigger. But Capone's genius was not in violence, it was in silence. He understood people, their wants, their fears, their weaknesses. He knew when to speak softly, when to let others talk, and when to disappear. That was his empire, built not only on illegal liquor, but on the quiet knowledge of how humans truly behaved when the law looked away. To the newspapers, he was a villain. To the poor, he was a benefactor, the man who handed out food during the Depression, who paid medical bills for families he never met. To the city, he was both plague and cure, the shadow it secretly admired. Every coin dropped into a collection plate, every glass poured in a back room seemed to echo his name. And somewhere, perhaps late at night, even Capone might have looked out his window over the city, not as a king, but as a man listening to the sound of his own creation. Chicago breathing. The city of smoke, restless and alive. The empire he built, and the quiet that always followed after. Morning came late to Chicago. The sun struggled to reach the ground, filtered through smoke and the shadow of rail bridges. The streets woke, not with birdsong, but with the hiss of steam, the grind of delivery carts, the shouts of vendors setting up their stalls. The city exhaled, heavy and alive again. Another day ruled by unspoken order. It was said that in Capone's Chicago, every man had a role, whether he knew it or not. The baker who sold bread to the speakeasy next door, the barber who trimmed the hair of men with guns under their coats, the priest who accepted donations without asking where the money came from. Power didn't announce itself here. It passed quietly through hands that pretended not to notice. Down by the river, men loaded trucks with barrels labeled olive oil. They smiled for the police officer who happened to walk past, and he smiled back, pretending not to see the glint of glass beneath the tarp. Everything worked because everyone understood the rules of silence. In this city, pretending was survival. To the outsider, Chicago looked chaotic, lawless, teetering on the edge. But for those who lived here, it had its own rhythm, its own logic. There were invisible boundaries that kept order, which streets belonged to which men, which bars could operate safely, which police captains needed envelopes under the table. Violence was not random, it was ritual. It followed rules older than any law written on paper. Capone himself was rarely seen. He didn't need to be. His presence moved through the city like a scent, faint but unmistakable. A payment delivered on time. A rival who disappeared quietly. A policeman transferred to another district without explanation. These were the whispers of an empire that ruled not through chaos, but through precision. In the speakeasies, jazz played softly behind thick curtains. The musicians didn't ask who owned the place, they just played. Men in suits drank amber-colored liquor from coffee cups, laughing too loudly, pretending to be at ease. Beneath the music, there was always tension, a sense that something might happen, but never did. That was Chicago's heartbeat, anticipation suspended in smoke. Sometimes, late at night, a truck would roll down an empty street, its engine humming low, its windows blacked out. The neighbors didn't look. The city had learned that curiosity could get you killed. The truck would vanish into the warehouse district, swallowed by shadows. By morning, the street would look unchanged. Chicago forgot quickly. Capone's genius lay in understanding that fear could coexist with comfort. He gave the city what it wanted: music, alcohol, money, and in return, it looked away. The people didn't want justice. They wanted warmth in winter, food on the table, and something to dull the noise in their heads. For many, Capone's empire felt safer than the government that had forgotten them. During Prohibition, liquor was not merely a vice, it was rebellion made liquid. A glass of whiskey became an act of defiance, a small protest against a system that demanded purity in an impure world. Capone didn't invent that feeling. He just sold it, bottled and delivered with efficiency. If you stood outside one of Capone's breweries, you'd hear the city's dual heartbeat, the steady churn of machinery and the distant rhythm of jazz. Inside, men worked quickly, their faces damp with sweat, bottles clinking in synchronized rhythm, a factory of rebellion. The irony was almost poetic. America outlawed the bottle, and in doing so, turned it into a symbol of freedom. Capone's network stretched far beyond Chicago, through the Midwest, into Florida, across to New York. But the city remained his heart. Every dollar that passed through a speakeasy, every truck that crossed the state line, was part of a system so intricate it resembled a living organism. Capone didn't control the chaos. He conducted it. Yet behind the efficiency and wealth, there was something strangely human. Capone loved music. He loved jokes. He sent flowers to widows and gifts to police officers' families. It wasn't hypocrisy. It was habit. In his world, kindness was currency, as useful as fear. A city doesn't run on cruelty alone. It runs on the illusion of decency. And so, Chicago continued to hum. An empire built not on marble or crowns, but on smoke, sound, and silence. The streets glistened with rain. The night trains passed like distant thunder. Somewhere, in a quiet office above the Lexington Hotel, a man in a tailored suit adjusted his cufflinks and smiled faintly at the sound of his city breathing. By midnight, the city began to change its rhythm again. The sound of streetcars faded. The laughter from the speakeasies grew muffled and slow, blurred by alcohol and fatigue. What remained was the steady hum of the unseen, the city's second life, the men who moved only after the curtains were drawn. On the top floor of the Lexington Hotel, Al Capone's suite was lit by a single lamp. The curtains were heavy, the air thick with cigar smoke. A phonograph played a slow tune from an Italian record, something nostalgic, something soft enough to drown out the noise of sirens beyond the glass. Here, Chicago's king sat alone at his desk, going through ledgers that held both profit and sin in equal measure. This was the part history often forgets. The quiet between the crimes, the spaces where nothing seemed to happen. Yet it was here, in this stillness, that Capone's empire truly existed. Not in the gunfire or the headlines, but in the calm precision of his planning, in the rhythm of his pen scratching numbers into paper. He was not an educated man in the traditional sense, but he understood economics better than most bankers. The city was his marketplace, its people his consumers. Supply and demand, that was all it ever was. Chicago wanted what it was told it couldn't have, and Capone had simply given it to them. Prohibition, to him, was not a moral debate, it was an opportunity wrapped in law. Sometimes he would pause, lean back in his chair and listen. Beyond the windows, faint jazz drifted up from the streets, the sound of his world still turning. He might have smiled then, not out of pride, but out of something like disbelief. For a man who had come from the gutters of Brooklyn, this must have felt like proof that America, despite everything, was still a place where hunger could build a throne. And yet, even kings are afraid of the dark. There were nights when the phone would ring, and he'd let it ring too long, fearing bad news before it came. Rivals, betrayals. He had seen too many men smile one day and vanish the next. The empire demanded blood, not just money. He knew that, he accepted it, but sometimes, in the silence after a deal was made, that knowledge pressed on him like the weight of the city itself. He had guards, of course, men posted in the hallway, men sleeping with revolvers beside the bed, but fear, once it enters the mind, cannot be guarded against. It lingers in small sounds, the creak of a floorboard, the whisper of wind through a half-open window, the echo of footsteps in an empty corridor. Capone lived surrounded by people and yet completely alone. Sometimes, late in the night, he would walk through the suite barefoot, past the heavy curtains, the polished table, the untouched glass of wine. He'd open the window just slightly, letting in the smell of rain and coal. The city lights shimmered below, gold and red and endless. He might have wondered, in that moment, if this was what victory was supposed to feel like, or if it was only another kind of prison. Outside, the city murmured on, a police siren somewhere distant, a jazz trumpet fading, the soft hiss of the river. Chicago never slept, not really. It only shifted its weight, dreaming through the smoke. The empire he built had no crown, no anthem, no flag, only rhythm, money, and fear. And yet, in the darkness, there was beauty, too, in how it all somehow held together, as fragile as glass. As the record clicked to its end, Capone leaned forward and stopped the turntable. The room fell silent. For a moment he sat completely still, as if listening for something beyond the walls, perhaps his own heartbeat, perhaps the ghosts of the men who'd built this city before him. Then, with a slow breath, he closed the ledger and whispered to no one in particular, "It's a beautiful city, if you don't look too close." Outside, dawn waited behind the clouds, patient and gray. Another day would begin soon, more deliveries, more deals, more laughter to hide the noise underneath. Chicago would wake again, and its king would disappear into its rhythm, unseen, but everywhere. The city of smoke, the empire of silence, the man at its heart, still listening. Before the empire, before the smoke and jazz and violence, there was a boy standing on a cracked Brooklyn sidewalk. The year was 1908. The street was lined with narrow tenement houses, their windows fogged with the breath of families who never stopped working. Laundry hung like flags of surrender between the buildings. The city smelled of salt and coal, bread and dust. His name was Alphonse Gabriel Capone, though to the neighborhood, he was just Al. His parents, Gabrielle and Teresa, had come from Naples with little more than hope and a barber's toolkit. They spoke in Italian at home, but outside their door, English ruled the world, harsh, fast, and full of edges. It was a world that didn't have time for slow tongues or old country manners. Young Al learned quickly that kindness wasn't a currency that's spent well in the streets. School was a battleground, not for knowledge, but for respect. Teachers demanded obedience. Classmates demanded proof. One wrong look could end with a fist, or worse. He was smart, but restless. One day, a teacher hit him for answering back. He never returned. That was the beginning of his education, not in books, but in people. The alleys became his classrooms, the older boys his professors. He watched how they talked, how they stood, how they made themselves larger than they were. He learned that power wasn't always about size. Sometimes it was about silence, about letting the other man speak first, and then saying the one thing that made him listen. Brooklyn in those days was a place of noise. Carriages rattling, trains shrieking, vendors calling out in half a dozen languages. Everyone wanted something. Everyone hustled. And if the law couldn't provide what you needed, someone else would. For the immigrant poor, morality was a luxury they couldn't afford. Capone's first jobs were small. Errands for men who never gave their full names. Delivering messages, cleaning up after fights, carrying boxes that felt heavier than they looked. But with each errand came a lesson. The men who lasted weren't the strongest. They were the ones who could smile while saying nothing at all. He met men who ran gambling dens out of back rooms and bars hidden behind fake walls. They taught him the language of the street, a mix of charm, threat, and humor. He learned that a man who can make others laugh can often make them obey. Even then his grin was famous, wide, disarming, full of mischief. But there were other lessons, darker ones. Brooklyn didn't forgive weakness. Fights broke out over debts, over insults, over pride. Capone saw blood early and understood that violence was not chaos, but currency. It bought silence, settled disputes, and sometimes earned respect. The trick was knowing when to spend it. At home, his mother prayed for him. She told him to keep his head down, to be a good man. He tried for a while. He worked at a candy store, then a bowling alley. But the streets had already chosen him. They had a way of whispering promises that honest work couldn't match. Money, admiration, belonging. For a boy like Al, born into noise, the streets were the only place that made sense. By 17, he was working for Frankie Yale, a name whispered with both fear and admiration in Brooklyn's underworld. Yale owned the Harvard Inn, a nightclub that smelled of perfume, sweat, and danger. Al was hired as a bouncer, his charm as useful as his fists. He greeted guests, broke up fights, and watched how the real money moved. It was there, one night, that he earned the scar that would define him. A man insulted a woman at the bar. Al intervened, too sharp, too confident. The man drew a knife. The cut ran from his left cheek to his jaw. The wound healed, but the scar stayed, twisting his grin into something unforgettable. From then on, they called him Scarface. Years later, when reporters asked him about it, he'd laugh. He'd say it was just a souvenir from Brooklyn. But in truth, it was more than that. It was the mark of initiation, a visible reminder that the city had claimed him. Every empire leaves scars. His just came early. The Harvard Inn was more than a nightclub. It was a world within a world. The laughter was thick with secrets. The music played over murmured deals. Capone learned to listen, really listen, to the space between words. It was there in that small silence that truth usually hid. Frankie Yale watched him closely. Yale was smooth where Al was raw, but he saw promise in the boy, a spark, a willingness to learn the art of appearing harmless. Yale taught him that power was best worn like a coat, visible enough to impress, but not so heavy it slowed you down. He taught him to smile when others raised their voices, to pay attention to the quietest man in the room, and to never, ever let anger make the first move. "Violence," Yale said, "is a tool, not a language." Capone remembered that line long after he left Brooklyn. There were nights when Al would stand at the club's back door, watching the carriages and early automobiles roll by. He could smell the salt from the nearby docks. The city felt endless, not because of its size, but because of its hunger. Everyone was chasing something, a name, a dollar, a way out. He wondered if there was any place in the world where a man could stop running. Sometimes, after closing, he'd help Yale's men transport crates to small boats that waited near the river. They said it was just wine, but Al knew better. The prohibition whispers were already in the air, talk that alcohol would soon be outlawed. But to the men who moved in shadows, the law wasn't an end. It was an opportunity, waiting to be exploited. It was in those nights, under a pale moon and the sound of clinking bottles, that he realized the street wasn't just about fighting or money. It was a system, intricate, disciplined, like the city itself. The men who thrived weren't brutes. They were architects of chaos, knowing exactly how much order to pretend to have. Frankie Yale began to trust him with more. Meetings, collections, negotiations, the kind that required charm more than muscle. Capone's disarming smile, the easy humor, the way he made people feel like he was on their side, it all made him valuable. It was in those conversations over cheap whiskey and loud jazz that he first learned how to build loyalty. But loyalty, like everything in Brooklyn, had a price. One night, one of Yale's men didn't pay what he owed. Yale sent Al. It wasn't the first time Al had carried a gun, but it was the first time he understood the weight it carried. Not just metal and powder, but the weight of being someone else's judgment. The man lived, barely. But from that night forward, people looked at Al differently. He'd crossed an invisible line. He went home that night and sat by the window of his mother's apartment. The city was quiet for once. The steam from the radiator hissed softly. He thought about what Yale had told him, about power, about restraint, and wondered if there was still room for kindness in the world he was walking into. His mother's rosary beads lay on the table beside him. He turned one between his fingers, but didn't pray. He tried to live quietly for a time. He married May, a kind Irish girl with soft eyes and a calm voice that balanced his restlessness. They moved into a small apartment, and soon their son Albert was born. For a moment, life seemed simple again. Dinners at home, neighbors who smiled, the laughter of a baby echoing in rooms too small to hold such warmth. But simplicity never lasts long in cities built on ambition. Yale's empire grew, so did his enemies. Fights turned to shootouts. Quiet deals became open wars. Al stayed loyal, but even he could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. There was talk of new territories, of Chicago, a city where opportunity burned like fire, and the law was just another negotiation. When the offer finally came, it wasn't dramatic. A man named Johnny Torrio, an old associate of Yale's, sent word from Chicago. There was work for capable men and room for growth. Yale told him to go, not as a farewell, but as a graduation. Chicago's where a man can make something of himself, he said, if you can stay alive long enough. And so in the spring of 1919, Al Capone boarded a train west. He didn't look back at Brooklyn as the train pulled away. He already knew what he was leaving behind. The noise, the hunger, the ghosts of alleys that had raised him. Ahead lay a city he'd never seen, but one that would soon remember his name forever. Chicago, 1919. The air was heavier than Brooklyn's, thicker, almost metallic. The train pulled into Union Station under a low gray sky, the city exhaling smoke and ambition. Skyscrapers were rising like steel prayers, their glass reflecting 1,000 uncertain dreams. It was a city on the edge of something, greatness or collapse, no one could tell which. Capone stepped off the platform and felt it immediately. This was not the same kind of noise. Chicago's chaos was different. It was faster, more deliberate. The people moved with purpose, even when they didn't know where they were going. The city was young, but already tired of its own speed. Johnny Torrio met him that afternoon, a quiet man, polished, always thinking 2 moves ahead. Torrio wasn't the kind to make grand entrances. His power lived in his calm. He shook Capone's hand firmly and smiled, not warmly, but knowingly. "You've got good instincts, kid," he said. "Brooklyn made you tough. Chicago will make you rich." Torrio's operation was clean, organized. Where Brooklyn had been wild and emotional, Chicago's underworld was a machine, each man a cog with a role to play. The city was divided into neighborhoods, each with its own loyalties and codes. Torrio's genius was that he didn't fight chaos, he managed it. Capone began his work quietly. He managed gambling houses, oversaw speakeasies, ensured shipments moved smoothly through the alleys and rivers that kept the city's thirst alive. It wasn't just alcohol he moved. It was the illusion of freedom. People wanted to drink not because they were rebellious, but because they wanted to forget. Outside, Prohibition had turned morality into business. The Volstead Act made the sale of alcohol illegal, but the demand never stopped. Every tavern that closed reopened underground. Every preacher condemning drink had a brother who ran whiskey. The city's veins pulsed with hypocrisy, and Capone was learning to read its rhythm. At night, Chicago changed. Streetlights glowed through mist. The river reflected a city pretending to sleep. Jazz floated through windows like perfume. The sound was restless. Horns, laughter, the faint click of heels on pavement. For many, this was freedom. For Capone, it was opportunity. Torrio often brought Capone to meetings with aldermen, police captains, and businessmen, the kind of men who never said what they meant. Capone sat, listened, learned. He noticed how Torrio handled them, how he offered favors instead of threats, how he promised stability in exchange for silence. This was a different kind of war, one fought not with bullets, but with handshakes. One evening, after a meeting at the Metropole Hotel, Torrio said something that stayed with him. "Violence draws attention. Money draws silence. Learn which one you need," and when Capone nodded but didn't answer, he already understood both too well. Chicago was teaching him restraint and patience. In Brooklyn, respect had come from survival. In Chicago, it came from control. He no longer needed to prove he was dangerous. The silence around his name began to do that for him. People spoke softly when they spoke about Al Capone, and he noticed how power began to follow him without needing to be chased. At home, May kept the small apartment tidy. Their son Sonny was growing fast, shy, gentle, nothing like the world his father moved in. Al loved him fiercely, though he rarely said it aloud. On Sundays, he'd take him to the park, away from the noise, just to sit and watch the ducks. It was his one quiet ritual. The newspapers hadn't learned his name yet. To the city, he was just another businessman in an expensive hat. But beneath that calm exterior, the gears were already turning. Prohibition had made outlaws into kings, and the boy from Brooklyn had finally found a kingdom worth ruling.
By 1921, Chicago was a city balanced on its own contradictions. The newspapers called it the capital of the new century, but its foundations were built on smoke and secrets. On one side, new money and moral reform. On the other, a quiet army of men who supplied everything the law denied. Capone walked the line between those worlds, and the city seemed to welcome him. His office moved to the Four Deuces, a narrow four-story building on South Wabash Avenue. From the outside, it looked like a simple restaurant and dance hall. Inside, the top floors housed gambling tables, backroom deals, and ledgers full of coded names. Capone worked behind the scenes, keeping the numbers clean and the men in line. He rarely raised his voice. When something went wrong, he'd sit quietly for a while, smoke curling in front of him, and then speak softly, almost kindly, about what needed to happen next. His men listened. They always did. Power, he found, was most convincing when it didn't have to shout. Chicago's law enforcement was already bending. Police captains came and went, each finding a way to coexist with the empire rising beneath their feet. Capone understood the unspoken rule. Make sure everyone eats. If a man took a bribe and felt well fed, he rarely bit the hand that fed him. By day, the city played innocent. By night, it pulsed with music. Jazz clubs in Bronzeville, speakeasies in the Loop, the sound of trumpets drifting down from hotel windows. Capone liked the music. It reminded him of Brooklyn's rhythm, loud, alive, unapologetic. Sometimes he'd step into a club quietly, hat low, just to feel the air vibrate. The newspapers still wrote about Torrio, not him. Torrio liked it that way. He ran his empire through charm and diplomacy. He made deals with rivals instead of destroying them. Capone respected that. But beneath his calm exterior, the younger man was watching carefully. He saw the flaws in Torrio's restraint, the cracks that would one day widen. The first time Capone ordered someone killed, it wasn't out of anger. It was business. A man had betrayed them, stolen shipments, bragged too loudly. Torrio hesitated. Capone didn't. If you let one get away, he said softly, the others start thinking they can run too. The body was found in the river a week later. No one asked questions. He'd sit in the living room late into the night, hat still on his knee, eyes far away. Sometimes he'd hum a tune from the clubs. Sometimes he'd just sit in silence, the sound of the city outside his window reminding him how alive and how fragile everything was. Chicago was beginning to change him. He started dressing better, tailored suits, silk ties, fine cigars. His laughter, once easy, grew calculated. The boy from Brooklyn who learned to fight for respect was slowly learning to be feared instead. People didn't just see Al Capone anymore. They saw what he could have them become, or what he could make them lose. Torrio's empire flourished under Prohibition. Beer and whiskey flowed through secret tunnels and back rooms. Capone kept the ledgers immaculate, and the profits unimaginable.
But every glass poured carried risk. A rival gang, a police raid, a deal gone wrong. Violence wasn't a last resort anymore. It was the cost of doing business. One evening, Torrio invited him to dinner. They spoke about expansion, westward toward Cicero, where the police were fewer and the voters cheaper. Torrio's tone was patient, measured, but Capone's mind was already racing. He saw more than expansion. He saw inheritance. He didn't want to just serve the empire. He wanted to become it. Chicago's skyline shimmered outside that restaurant window, full of light, full of possibility. Capone leaned back, cigar in hand, and smiled slightly. In this city of opportunity, he had finally found something that looked like destiny. By 1923, Chicago's heart was overflowing. The city had grown too crowded for Torrio's empire. Too many eyes, too many questions, too many bodies floating in the river. The press had begun whispering names in print, and the police were pretending to care. Torrio needed space, distance, a quieter seat of power. That's when they looked west, toward Cicero. Cicero was small then, a suburb pretending to be respectable, a town of factories, bars, and working families, the kind of place where people wanted peace more than politics. But peace could be bought, and politics could be shaped. Torrio saw it as a refuge. Capone saw it as a canvas. They arrived quietly, one building at a time. First came the bars, then the gambling halls. Torrio paid the mayor, the sheriff, the councilmen. He didn't have to threaten them. He simply made them richer. Within months, the town was humming with hidden life. 1,000 bottles poured behind 1,000 closed doors. Cicero was becoming Chicago's shadow. Capone was sent to oversee the operation. At first, he played the diplomat, meeting local businessmen, attending dinners, shaking hands. He wore soft suits and smiled like a visiting gentleman, but underneath that charm, he was calculating everything. The roots, the loyalties, the weaknesses. He had learned from Torrio, you don't conquer with fear at first. You conquer with favors. It was the 1924 municipal elections that changed everything. Torrio wanted a friendly administration, one that would look the other way while the empire ran beneath the surface. Capone handled it personally. His men visited polling stations, escorting voters, replacing ballot boxes when necessary. By sundown, Cicero belonged to them. Democracy, they learned, could be bought as easily as whiskey. But the move wasn't without blood. Rival gangs, police loyal to reformists, and even Chicago's own politicians began pushing back. On Election Day, the streets turned violent, gunfire echoing between brick walls, cars speeding through dust. Capone's brother Frank was killed in the chaos. When the news reached Al, witnesses said he didn't speak for nearly a minute. He just stared out the window, jaw tight, hands trembling. Frank had been the gentle one, polite, disciplined, the kind of man who still believed they could keep things civilized. His death tore something out of Al. That night, Cicero stopped being Torrio's refuge. It became Capone's kingdom. From then on, everything changed. Capone ruled Cicero not through Torrio's diplomacy, but through presence. His cars patrolled the streets in daylight. His men stood guard outside hotels and bars. He didn't hide anymore. He made himself visible, untouchable. People stopped asking who ran the town. They started asking what Al Capone wanted next. The local press began printing his name. Cicero's new boss, they called him. Reporters were drawn to him fascinated by his contradictions. The soft-spoken man in expensive suits who attended church, kissed his son, and then ordered a raid an hour later. He treated them kindly, gave interviews, smiled for cameras. The public adored him, and the myth began. At night, though, he still visited the Four Deuces in Chicago, where Torrio stayed. They would talk over quiet drinks. Torrio, ever the strategist, warned him to stay cautious, that fame was a double-edged knife. Capone would nod, but inside he already knew the truth. Once people believed in the myth, it became stronger than the man himself. Cicero became a paradox, violent yet orderly, corrupt yet prosperous. Workers were paid well, businesses thrived, and police salaries mysteriously doubled. The townspeople pretended not to see what was happening, because their lives were easier. That, Capone realized, was the real secret to power. Not fear alone, but comfort. If people slept well, they didn't ask why. By the time spring came in 1925, Cicero was breathing to Capone's rhythm. The smoke from its taverns rose like incense to his empire. Each glass poured, each note played by the jazz bands at night. All of it carried his signature, unseen but undeniable. Even the priests, some whispered, knew better than to mention his name from the pulpit, not out of fear, but out of a quiet, pragmatic respect. Torrio by then had grown weary. He'd always been a businessman first, methodical, patient, detached. But the city was changing faster than he could manage. Violence had begun to spiral beyond his taste for order. The Volstead Act had turned morality into a commodity, and men like Capone were profiting not just from liquor, but from chaos itself. Capone respected him deeply, called him Papa Johnny. But in the quiet moments, Al could see that Torrio was slipping away. His mentor was still sharp, but cautious to the point of hesitation. And hesitation in their world was a luxury no one could afford. Then came the ambush. It was January 1925. Torrio was leaving his apartment when rival gang members from the O'Banion crew opened fire. Bullets tore through his car door, shattered glass, and nearly ended his life. He survived by inches. When Capone visited him in the hospital, Torrio's voice was barely a whisper. "It's yours now, Al," he said. "You take it." Capone didn't celebrate. He simply nodded and left the hospital in silence. That night he drove through Cicero alone. He passed the taverns, the gambling dens, the warehouses where whiskey was stored behind stacks of crates. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. For the first time he felt the full weight of it. The empire was no longer someone else's plan. It was his. He moved his headquarters to the Hawthorne Hotel, turning it into both fortress and office. From its top floor he could see the whole town, the neon signs, the streets he owned, the police cars that worked for him. He liked to stand at the window late at night, drink in hand, watching the lamps flicker below. "All of this," he once murmured to a friend, "built from one bad law." His reign was built on contradictions. He paid his men generously and treated them like family, yet he punished betrayal with unsparing cruelty. He funded soup kitchens for the poor, handing out meals during the Depression, yet he also flooded those same streets with bootleg whiskey. In his mind, it wasn't hypocrisy, it was balance. The city, he said, had both saints and sinners, and sometimes they wore the same hat. In Cicero, the people adapted.
The townsfolk learned to speak softly in the presence of his men. Shopkeepers gave small discounts to his drivers, knowing it was good insurance. At night, the bars filled with laughter and jazz. Prohibition had turned everyone into accomplices. The only difference was that Capone had the means to make it beautiful. And yet, amid the luxury and control, Capone began to change. He had power now, but peace eluded him. Every morning, the phone rang with reports, arrests, raids, rival movements. He'd light a cigar, pour his coffee, and listen without emotion. But behind that calm expression, something restless stirred. Power, he realized, demanded constant vigilance. You could never truly sleep. He surrounded himself with loyalty, not out of affection, but necessity. Jack McGurn, Frank Nitti, and others became his inner circle. They were efficient, loyal, and utterly ruthless. Each one owed him their success, and each one knew that to betray him was to vanish. In that unspoken understanding, his empire found stability, the kind that comes not from law, but from fear disguised as loyalty. By the end of 1925, Chicago and its suburbs were firmly his. Cicero thrived as the heart of his empire, a mix of sin and civility. The newspapers called him the King of Chicago. He would smile when he saw the headlines, but behind that grin was exhaustion. To the world, he was untouchable. To himself, he was already haunted. Sometimes, in the quietest hours before dawn, he would step out onto the hotel balcony. The streets below were empty, glistening with dew. Somewhere, a saxophone played faintly in a distant bar. He'd look out across the horizon, the factories, the skyline, the endless smoke, and murmur to himself, almost softly, "This is all noise. Just noise." He didn't know it then, but his greatest battles were yet to come, not in the streets, but in the mirror. The empire had risen, and like every empire, it would demand a price far higher than gold. By 1926, Al Capone had become more than a man. He was an idea, a whisper that traveled from Chicago's alleys to Wall Street's headlines. People said his name with awe and with fear. He no longer needed to hide behind Torrio's shadow or behind coded language. Everyone knew who ran the city now. He was only 27, but wealth had aged him. The suits grew sharper, the cigars thicker, the eyes quieter. His mornings began not with gunfire, but with paperwork, shipments, payouts, bribes, profits. He would sit at his desk, gold ring glinting in the light, reading ledgers worth millions. Yet sometimes he would pause, lean back and stare at the mirror across from him, the one that hung above the bar in his office. For a long time he would just watch himself watching. He had everything he had once dreamed of: money, power, respect. But the mirror told a different story. It showed lines deepening too early, eyes that never slept. Behind the confidence there was calculation. Behind the laughter, a constant, invisible inventory of threats. Power, he realized, didn't free a man. It trapped him. Still, he played his part perfectly. To the public, he was the generous king, the man who made sure the poor could eat during hard winters, who smiled for photographers, who tipped newsboys extra coins. To his men, he was the boss, decisive, fair, unpredictable only when betrayed. And to his enemies, he was the storm they could never predict. Chicago's newspapers couldn't get enough of him. They printed his quotes, his jokes, his tailored suits.
Reporters waited outside the Hawthorne Hotel, hoping to catch even a single remark. He gave interviews like a movie star. Sometimes he'd talk about baseball, or about how prohibition was the real crime, not him. The city loved the performance, a villain who smiled. And yet each night ended the same way. Capone, alone in his suite, the jazz fading below, the city lights flickering across his face. He'd pour himself a drink, light a cigar, and sit quietly. The laughter from downstairs would drift up like ghosts. Sometimes he'd pick up a newspaper, scan the headlines, and chuckle. Other times he'd close his eyes and imagine Brooklyn, the boy he used to be, running through narrow streets with nothing but a cap and a dream. But the ghosts never stayed quiet for long. He was beginning to hear them, not real voices, but echoes of every betrayal, every deal gone wrong, every shot fired. He started sleeping less. Bodyguards became thicker around him, their eyes sharper, their hands always near their coats. Even in laughter, he listened for danger. The violence that had built his kingdom now circled him like orbiting debris. In 1926 and 1927, the city bled. Gang rivalries grew personal. The Jenna brothers, the O'Banions, the North Side Gang, each wanted what Capone had. Drive-by shootings became weekly news. Civilians began dying in the crossfire. And yet, somehow, people still admired him. Perhaps because in their eyes he embodied the chaos of America itself, bold, reckless, unstoppable. He knew he was walking on a wire. Fame had its own gravity. Once you rose too high, there was no coming down softly. Capone began to trust fewer people. Meetings grew shorter, temper sharper. He started to retreat into himself, to a private world where mirrors replaced friends. Sometimes, witnesses said, he'd spend long minutes in front of that same mirror, adjusting his tie again and again, as if trying to convince the reflection to believe in him. He once told a journalist, "I'm just a businessman, giving people what they want." It was half true. He knew that what people wanted wasn't just alcohol. It was escape from the law, from poverty, from fear. He sold illusion wrapped in style. And somewhere along the way, he began believing in it too. By 1928, the mirror no longer showed a face. It showed a mask. Capone's reflection had become its own invention, smooth, calm, untouchable. The newspapers saw that mask. The photographers captured it, and America devoured it. But behind that still image was a man unraveling, thread by thread, inside the silk of his success. His empire had reached its peak. Money flowed in from every direction: speakeasies, brothels, gambling dens, distilleries. It was said he made more in a week than most Americans did in a lifetime. Yet the air around him was tightening. Federal agents were growing bolder, politicians more public in their disgust, rivals more desperate in their ambition. And the public, once charmed, was beginning to look at him with unease. Capone felt it, the slow shift of wind. He began changing his habits. Where once he moved openly through Chicago, now he traveled in convoys of black sedans, flanked by bodyguards who would die for him. He avoided restaurants he once loved, slept in different rooms each night, and started using coded phrases for simple instructions. Paranoia, he'd say, was just good business. He bought a mansion in Palm Island, Florida, hoping that distance would buy peace. It didn't. Even there, the stillness felt like a trap. He'd sit on the veranda at sunset, watching the sky burn orange over the bay, and all he could think of was the noise of Chicago, the laughter, the sirens, the shouts, The silence frightened him more than bullets ever had. At night, he'd drink and pace the tiled halls, cigar in hand, murmuring names under his breath. Old allies, old enemies. Sometimes he'd laugh softly to himself, shaking his head, as if arguing with ghosts. Other times his laughter stopped suddenly, replaced by stillness so absolute even his guards hesitated to breathe. He wasn't going mad yet, but the seed had been planted. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, the streets were painting their own mythology. Gang wars raged like underground weather, invisible but felt everywhere. Every tavern conversation came with a glance over the shoulder. The newspapers named the city Murder Town, and Capone, though away, remained its center, the eye of a storm he could no longer control. Then came the bloodiest whisper of them all, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. February 14th, 1929. 7 men gunned down in a garage on North Clark Street. Capone was in Florida when it happened, playing cards and laughing over lunch, but no one believed his innocence. The image was too perfect. The ruthless king striking his rivals down on a day devoted to love. The massacre changed everything. The public, once half in love with him, turned away. Even politicians who had taken his money began to distance themselves. Capone could no longer be the charming outlaw. He had become a national villain. He tried to dismiss it, calling it just business. But the Mirror no longer agreed. In the weeks that followed, his sleep grew thinner. Guards heard him muttering in his room, arguing with someone unseen. He'd wake drenched in sweat, light a cigar, and pace the floorboards until sunrise. His empire still stood. The bars still opened, the cars still ran, the bribes still flowed, but something in him had cracked. The mask was slipping, and the man beneath was beginning to remember he was mortal. The journalists noticed the change. His smiles became rarer. The suits remained immaculate, but the eyes no longer matched the charm. He began speaking less in public, withdrawing behind closed doors, watching from behind his windows as the city began to turn against him. In private moments, he'd sit at his desk with a mirror nearby, running a hand over his face, staring, as if trying to recognize himself. Once, he whispered to a friend, "They don't hate me. They hate the idea of me. But the idea is the only thing left." For the first time in years, he seemed smaller than his legend. He still commanded men, still gave orders, but his voice had softened, almost weary. Some said he no longer trusted even his own reflection. Others said he'd finally begun to see the truth, that power, once absolute, begins to rot from within, silently, like fruit left too long in the sun. By 1930, Chicago had grown quiet again, not peaceful, but tired. The roar of the 20s had dimmed into a dull hum, like a radio left on in an empty room. The jazz still played, but softer now, as if the musicians, too, were waiting for something to end. And in that quiet, Capone's empire, once a golden machine of smoke and money, began to rust. He could feel it. There was a tension in the air he couldn't name, not from rival gangs, not from police, but from within his own walls. Men who once smiled at him now spoke softer, stood further away. Some had grown rich and restless. Others had begun to fear what loyalty to Capone now meant in the eyes of the law. The newspapers had turned fully against him. Gone were the playful headlines, the amused tone of the Robin Hood of Chicago. Now, every article bore accusation. "Capone Empire crumbling," one read. "IRS closing in." The taxmen, quiet, relentless men in gray suits, were becoming his most dangerous enemies. They didn't carry guns, but they carried ledgers, and that was worse. Capone dismissed it at first. "How can they get me for taxes?" He laughed to his lawyer. "I never wrote anything down." But the laughter didn't reach his eyes. The government had grown tired of chasing bullets. They were chasing numbers now, and numbers never missed. At night, the phone never stopped ringing. Reports from his lieutenants came in waves. Raids, arrests, betrayals. Each week, another name disappeared or turned informant. He began to see ghosts in every corner. When one of his closest men, Ralph Bottles Capone, was questioned by federal agents, Al's trust cracked further. Family, business, blood, they were all bleeding together. Outside, the Great Depression had begun. The streets were filling with hunger, with silence. Soup lines stretched down the blocks, the same blocks where Capone's men once sold liquor to laughter. He noticed the shift. Even power felt different now. No one wanted champagne anymore. They wanted bread. Capone tried to adapt. He opened one of the first large-scale soup kitchens, serving thousands of free meals a day. Reporters photographed him ladling stew, smiling like a benevolent prince. It was part kindness, part performance. But as he watched the weary faces passing by, even he seemed unsure which part was real. Yet generosity could not wash away the blood that had built his throne. He still ruled from Cicero, but fewer people came to visit. Even his parties grew smaller. The laughter that once filled his rooms now echoed against walls lined with silence. The jazz played slower. The women left earlier. And Capone began to realize that the one thing he couldn't buy, the one thing money refused to return, was time. He took longer drives now, aimlessly circling the outskirts of the city. Sometimes, his driver said, he'd stop near the edge of Lake Michigan and just sit there, staring at the water. The city he had owned stretched behind him, a glittering mirage built on fear and whiskey. He'd mutter softly, "It was never supposed to get this big." But there was no shrinking an empire like his. Every crack in the foundation revealed another betrayal, another debt unpaid. Men he had once trusted were making deals with the government. Rivals were resurfacing, weaker but louder. And through it all, the IRS kept digging, not into his crimes, but into his accounts. He tried to maintain control through habit, the daily ritual of cigars, meetings, poker games, soft jazz at dinner. But even those comforts had turned mechanical. His laughter came late, his jokes shorter. He seemed distracted, as if the walls were whispering his own story back to him. One night, his bodyguard McGurn found him sitting alone, staring at the mirror again. The same one he'd brought from Cicero to every new home, a silent witness to his empire's rise. McGurn asked what he was thinking. Capone didn't answer right away. He simply said, "You ever notice how the shadows in a mirror move before you do?" It was then that he began sleeping with a pistol under his pillow again. The empire was fading into its own reflection. Wealth without warmth, fame without safety. The shadow he had cast over Chicago was now falling back upon him. Every man he had once owned now carried a piece of his downfall in their pocket. The day the indictment came, the air felt heavier than usual. Chicago was caught between two seasons, the last warmth of summer fading into an early chill. Capone's house on Palm Island gleamed like a mirage under the sun. Yet inside, it was strangely quiet. The phone lines had stopped ringing. The laughter had gone. All that remained was the sound of distant waves breaking against the seawall, like an old clock counting down. They said it wasn't the murders or the smuggling that would end him. It was taxes. A charge so small it felt almost insulting. But Capone understood the insult for what it was: a weapon. The government hadn't just come for his money, they had come for his name. And for a man who had built his empire on reputation, that was the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. In his mind, he replayed the old days, when his name opened doors, when reporters rushed to hear his jokes, when judges shook his hand. Now those same hands had turned away. Even his lawyers spoke to him like he was already half gone. The empire of shadows was not collapsing in noise, but in silence. A quiet, orderly disassembly, one file at a time, one testimony at a time. He was ordered to appear in court. The cameras were waiting, hungry as ever. He stepped from the car in his gray suit and cream-colored hat, immaculate, calculated, the same way he'd always entered a room. But behind the smile, his eyes were scanning everything. The reporters, the policemen, even the curious onlookers. Everyone was watching him, and for the first time, he wasn't sure why. The trial became theater. Every witness, another scene. Every piece of paper, a weapon. They spoke of bank accounts, coded ledgers, cash hidden in cigar boxes. Capone's men tried to deny everything, but the math told a simpler story than any confession could. The empire that had fed hundreds now stood exposed by a few columns of numbers. For weeks he sat there, unmoving, patient, but inside something frayed. Each testimony peeled away a layer of myth. He had once been untouchable. Now he was a man in a chair waiting for judgment. The same papers that once glorified him were now counting the days until his fall. At night, back at the Lexington Hotel, he'd pour himself a glass of wine and stare out the window. Below him the city continued, indifferent, buzzing, alive. Cars passed, lights flickered, people laughed. And for the first time in years, Chicago no longer belonged to him. It had moved on. It always does. When the verdict came guilty, he didn't shout, didn't beg. He simply nodded once, as if confirming something he had already known. 11 years in prison. Not for the blood, not for the bootlegging, but for the numbers he thought no one would ever see. A paper empire undone by paper hands. The newspapers called it the end of an era. But eras don't end overnight. They fade like smoke leaving a glass room. Even in chains, Capone's name still drifted through Chicago's alleys, whispered like a memory. Men still toasted him in secret bars. Women still told stories of the night they saw him smile. Legends, after all, die slower than men. In Alcatraz, where he would soon be sent, there were no mirrors. The walls were bare, the windows too narrow to see through. But even there he carried his empire with him, in his silence, in the way other inmates glanced his way, unsure whether to fear or pity him. He became quieter each week, more distant, as if the shadows he had once commanded had turned inward. The guards said he would sit for hours staring at the wall, humming softly to himself, old Italian tunes from his childhood. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he wept. They said he spoke to people who weren't there, whispering names long dead or disappeared. The empire of shadows had followed him here too, but now it spoke only to him. When the sun set, he'd look toward the tiny window and murmur, "I used to own the night." The words floated up, caught between iron and sea air, and outside, the Pacific rolled on, endless and unbothered, erasing, as it always does, the noise of men who thought they could rule forever.
The fog around Alcatraz never lifted completely. It hung there like a living thing, swallowing the edges of the island, softening the clang of steel doors and the shuffle of chained feet. To most it was a prison. To Capone, it felt like penance, the quiet ending of a noisy life. His cell was small, 8 feet by 5, painted the color of stale bread. The walls held the scent of rust and bleach, the faint echo of footsteps that never seemed to stop. When he first arrived, he walked with that old confidence, chin up, coat sharp, hat tilted at a perfect angle. But Alcatraz did not care who you were. Here every man was stripped to his smallest truth. The guards had been instructed not to treat him differently. Some called him Capone, others Al. He didn't seem to mind. There was a calmness to him now, as if the island's silence had seeped into his bones. He followed the rules, swept his cell, made his bed tight enough for inspection. To the other inmates it was strange, the once feared king of Chicago now folding blankets with quiet precision. The first letter he wrote came 3 weeks after his arrival. It was addressed to his wife, May. The handwriting was neat at first, almost elegant, a relic from the days when every deal began with ink and paper. He thanked her for the package, for her prayers, for the memory of home. He ended the letter with a sentence that trembled slightly. "Tell Sonny I'm okay. It's quiet here. Maybe that's good for me." In the yard, he kept mostly to himself. The wind was sharp there, carrying the salt of the sea and the smell of wet stone. Sometimes he would walk in slow circles humming old tunes, songs from the speakeasies, from nights now buried under 1,000 headlines. To the other inmates, it sounded ghostly, almost sad. To Capone, it was simply a way to remember who he used to be. His second letter was shorter, the handwriting less steady. He wrote of the weather, of the guards of the ocean that roared like an audience he could no longer command. Then, almost like an afterthought, he added, "Sometimes I think about the old places, the club, the lights. Feels like a dream someone else lived." The warden noted his good behavior, his politeness. Capone was no longer the man who ordered fear. He spoke softly now, even to guards. He asked questions about their families, their children. It wasn't charm. It was something quieter, almost human, as if he had finally discovered the cost of being larger than life. But something was changing behind his eyes. Some days he forgot where he was. He'd talk about going back to the office or meeting the boys in Cicero. At first the guards thought he was joking. Then they realized he wasn't. The doctor said the syphilis he had carried for years was beginning to reach his brain. He began writing less frequently after that. The letters came slower, shorter, sometimes incomprehensible. One was only half finished, a single line repeating over and over, "I'll be home soon. Don't worry. I'll be home soon." May kept them all, folding them neatly, reading them as if the words themselves were fragile bones from another lifetime. The other inmates began to look at him differently. He wasn't Scarface anymore. He was just another man lost inside his own silence. Sometimes in the middle of the night they'd hear him strumming a guitar softly, almost tenderly.
No one remembered how he got it, but the guards let it be. They said it made the nights feel less cruel.
Once, a guard overheard him whispering as he played,
"You know, I never liked the blood. I liked the music, the laughter. The blood just came with it. It was said without regret, without guilt. Just an old man tracing the edges of his past, as if touching the ghosts one by one." The fog thickened that winter. The sea grew louder, as if the island were trying to erase its own memories. Capone kept humming. Sometimes he called out names. "Johnny! Frankie! May!" Like he was still walking the streets of Chicago, calling for men who were long gone. No one corrected him. Even Alcatraz had learned to let ghosts have their way.
By 1938, the letters stopped.
May still went to the post office each week, waiting for one that never came. Sometimes the warden sent short notes instead, typed, clinical, detached. They said Capone's health was failing, that he had been moved to the hospital wing, that he spoke less now. No mention of the music, no mention of the fog, just silence written in official language. In Alcatraz, the silence around him had deepened. He no longer recognized the guards who brought his meals. When they called his name, he sometimes smiled politely, as if greeting strangers. To them he seemed peaceful, a quiet old man lost in a dream. But sometimes in the dead of night, he would wake screaming, calling for a boy named Sonny, or for his mother, or for men long buried under Chicago's streets. The doctors noted progressive neurological decline. Those words meant little to the other inmates. They only knew that the once mighty Capone was gone, replaced by a man who no longer remembered the weight of a gun, or the smell of rain on Cicero streets, or the sound of jazz echoing through a speakeasy at midnight. He had become an echo himself, fading into the hum of the prison's heartbeat. Sometimes the guards would find him sitting cross-legged on the floor, whispering to the wall. They said he spoke as though conducting a meeting, pausing to laugh, to nod, to raise a glass that wasn't there. When asked who he was talking to, he'd grin and say, "The boys. You don't hear 'em?" The guards would look at the empty space and nod quietly. No one wanted to argue with a man who was already halfway gone. The music returned one evening, faint but steady. Someone heard him humming again, a slow, uneven rhythm. But this time, the song was different. No more jazz or swing. It was something older, slower. An Italian lullaby his mother once sang in Brooklyn, when the world was small enough to fit inside a single kitchen window. He began to write again, or tried to. The letters were fragmented, words broken, sentences looping back on themselves. May received one that simply read, "The sea is nice. I see boats sometimes. They don't stop here. I think they forgot." The handwriting was crooked, the ink smeared, but she held it as if it were gold. It was the last one that ever reached her. Back on the island, the guards noticed how he stared at the ocean more often. Some said he was trying to remember how to be a man. Others thought he was waiting for the tide to take him home. Whatever it was, there was something calm about him now, like the final light after a storm. He no longer spoke of power or money, only of warmth, only of the sea. When they finally transferred him from Alcatraz to the Federal Hospital in Baltimore, the papers barely noticed. The country had moved on to new crimes, new wars, new headlines. The age of bootleg kings and Tommy guns had turned sepia, fading into nostalgia. Capone arrived at the hospital, frail, confused, smiling faintly, as if on a pleasant vacation. He no longer remembered Alcatraz. He no longer remembered Chicago.
The nurses said he was polite, almost childlike. He would tip his hat to them each morning, hum softly as he walked the halls, and sometimes tell stories no one could follow. "Did I ever tell you about my club?" he'd ask. "Everyone came, even the mayor." Then his voice would drift off, as if he'd just remembered that the mayor and the club and the world itself had vanished somewhere he couldn't reach. He had become, in every sense, a ghost, still wearing flesh. The legend of Al Capone was gone. What remained was Alphonse, the boy from Brooklyn who once dreamed of something simple, something clean. In the end, he remembered little of his empire, but sometimes he remembered his mother's voice, and that seemed to be enough. And as the fog rolled once more over San Francisco Bay, the sound of the sea filled the space where his laughter used to be. The man who once ruled Chicago's nights now belonged to the silence. A silence that neither feared nor forgave. It simply was. The house sat low against the Florida coast, white walls gleaming beneath the sun, surrounded by palm trees that swayed with the slow rhythm of the tide. It looked peaceful, too peaceful for a man who once ruled a city of noise. This was Palm Island, 1940. Here, Al Capone lived not as a king, but as a relic, a memory wearing the shape of a man. The neighbors knew who he was, of course, everyone did. But the Capone who had returned from Alcatraz was no longer the monster of headlines. He moved slowly, spoke softly, and smiled with the uncertain warmth of a man trying to remember why he should. The newspapers called him retired. Those who saw him called him changed. He spent his mornings by the water, fishing in silence. Sometimes May would join him, bringing coffee in a small porcelain cup. They rarely spoke. The sea did most of the talking, waves folding and unfolding like long, unbroken sighs. There were days he didn't recognize her, and yet he always smiled when she appeared, as if some part of him, buried deep within the fog of memory, still remembered love. Inside the house, the rooms were quiet but full of echoes. Old photographs lined the mantel, weddings, dinners, newspaper clippings yellowed at the edges. Sometimes Capone would stop and stare at them for long minutes. He'd trace his fingers over faces, men whose names he could no longer recall, and whisper to himself, "They were good boys. They worked hard." Then he'd turn away, humming again, as if to drown out what time had taken. The doctors called it neurosyphilis. May called it the forgetting. Each month it stole something new, a face, a name, a year. And yet, strangely, it gave something back, gentleness. The man who once ruled through fear now laughed softly, spoke kindly, thanked the servants, blessed his food. In losing himself, Al Capone had found what he had spent a lifetime hiding. In the afternoons, he napped in a wicker chair on the terrace. The radio played faintly, big band music, news bulletins, the voices of a world he no longer belonged to. Sometimes he'd wake suddenly, eyes wide, and ask the butler if the boys from the office had called. When told no, he'd nod, mutter, "Good," and drift back to sleep. At times, visitors came. Old associates, reporters, even curious tourists who managed to find the house. Most left unsettled. The legend they had imagined was gone, replaced by a man who offered them lemonade and asked about their families.
One journalist wrote that seeing Capone was like finding Caesar tending roses. Another wrote nothing at all, as if to put words to it would betray the silence. There were moments, though, when the fog in his mind would part. Brief flashes, fragments of clarity sharp as glass. He'd speak suddenly, his voice strong again, eyes bright. He'd talk about Chicago, the deals, the laughter, the betrayals. For a few minutes, the king returned. But then the tide would pull him back into stillness, leaving only the old man with the soft voice. May learned to recognize those moments. She would sit near him, listening without interruption, letting him relive whatever scenes surfaced from the ruins of memory. He would always end the same way, leaning back with a sigh. It was a good run, wasn't it? And she would nod, whispering, "Yes, Al." It was, even if he no longer knew what it was. On Sundays, he liked to feed the birds. He'd scatter breadcrumbs across the lawn, chuckling as seagulls swooped and squawked around him. To anyone watching, it was an old man's pastime, but May saw something else. A man practicing the art of peace, at last learning to give without taking. The neighbors sometimes heard him singing, soft, slow tunes from another century. His voice cracked but tender, half Italian, half forgotten. Children who passed by the fence would stop to listen. To them, he wasn't a gangster or a ghost, just a kindly man humming to the sea. The years along the Florida coast drifted by like soft tides, each wave a little slower, each sunrise a little dimmer. The house began to age with him. Paint peeled along the shutters, salt crept into the metal fixtures, and the once bustling rooms fell into a rhythm of footsteps, radio static, and the creak of wicker chairs. Palm Island became a kind of island within time, a place where the past walked silently through open doors and lingered in the hallways. Capone's health faltered slowly, not with sudden collapse, but through small betrayals. His hands trembled when lifting a cup. His words wandered mid-sentence. He forgot where he kept his hat, then later what a hat was for. Yet sometimes, in the soft glow of afternoon, a smile would cross his face, unprovoked, unexplainable, as if his mind had found a gentle place to rest. May remained steadfast. She'd guide him to the table, help him with his medicine, listen to his rambling stories that twisted between truth and dream. The servants learned to lower their voices, to walk softly, as though afraid to disturb the delicate web that held his mind together. To them, he was not the infamous Scarface, but Mr. Capone, a fragile man who sometimes forgot the day, but never forgot to say thank you. He began to write letters again, or tried to, scrawled notes in trembling script, to his son, to old friends, to people who were long dead. Sometimes he'd dictate them to May, speaking slowly, as if the words were bricks he was carefully laying to rebuild a crumbled house. In one letter he wrote, "Tell Sonny I'm happy. The sun is warm here. The birds sing early. I think I'll go swimming soon." He hadn't swum in years, but in his mind he still could. At nights, the sea grew louder. The waves struck the rocks with a sound that echoed through his dreams. Sometimes he would wake, calling out names. Frank, Johnny, Ralph. Voices from another life. May would come running, hold his hand, whisper, "It's all right, Al. They're gone now." He would nod, still half in the past, murmuring, "I know, but I can still hear them." By 1946, the doctors visited often. They came with their leather bags and quiet eyes, whispering in hallways when May wasn't listening. They knew what she didn't want to hear, that the mind of Alphonse Capone had already drifted far beyond their reach. One doctor wrote in his notes, "Patient presents childlike demeanor, sings to himself, speaks affectionately to inanimate objects. No agitation. They didn't know he was simply talking to ghosts."
Sometimes he would sit by the shore for hours, staring at the horizon. When asked what he was looking at, he'd answer, "Chicago." It wasn't there, of course, only miles of salt water and sky. But perhaps in the geography of memory, Chicago had always been made of waves and smoke. The city had never really left him. It had only changed shape. In his final winter, he took to speaking softly to the sea. He'd whisper old lines from songs, phrases in Italian, bits of conversation that only he could follow. Sometimes he'd laugh suddenly, delighted by a joke no one else heard. The servants would watch from a distance, unsure if they were witnessing madness or grace. The morning he died, the house was unusually quiet. The air was still, the sea gentle. May found him in his chair by the window, eyes closed, lips curved faintly upward. There was no struggle, no noise, only the faint smell of salt, the distant hum of the radio, and the long sigh of the tide. After years of noise, the man who built an empire of chaos left the world in silence. The funeral was small. No politicians, no gangsters, just family. A few old friends and a handful of curious reporters kept at a distance. The newspapers wrote their usual fare. Capone dies at 48. Gangster King ends life in obscurity. But that wasn't quite true. He hadn't ended in obscurity. He had ended in forgiveness, not from the world, but from himself. Afterward, May lived quietly in the same house, long after the journalists stopped calling. She kept the radio tuned to his favorite station. Sometimes, in the stillness of evening, she swore she could hear him humming along. When the wind carried the sound of the sea through the open windows, it almost sounded like laughter. Soft, familiar, and free. There are no monuments to Al Capone by the sea, no plaques, no marble statues. Only that quiet house, aging gently, filled with the ghosts of a man who once ruled a world of noise. Palm Island remains. The waves still come and go, like the breath of something that never truly ends. Long after the house by the sea grew quiet, the city he once ruled began to whisper his name again. Not as a curse this time, nor as a warning, but as a kind of legend, spoken in bars and alleys and late-night radio stories. Al Capone, they said, had never truly died. He had simply dissolved into the brickwork of Chicago itself. The Chicago River still carried the reflections of the world he built. Warehouses, speakeasies, backroom doors hidden behind neon signs. And though decades had passed, some claimed that if you listened closely near the old docks, you could hear the echo of engines, laughter, and the distant rhythm of jazz, the music of an empire that ran on whiskey, fear, and loyalty. Capone's empire had collapsed long before his death, of course, but pieces of it lingered. Fragments absorbed by others, reshaped, renamed. The syndicates he helped create became quieter, cleaner, smarter. The violence moved behind walls. The money found new ways to hide. He had taught them all how to build shadows and how to live inside them. Historians would later argue that he was a symptom
not a cause, a reflection of his time. Prohibition had created him. The thirst of a nation had crowned him. And when that thirst ended, so too did his kingdom. But the myth remained, because myths are immune to law. They grow wherever there's a story that feels too human to let go. In the years after his fall, movies began to reshape him, first as a villain, then as a legend. The screenwriters gave him charm, wit, style. They turned his brutality into rhythm, his greed into ambition. He became not the man he was, but the story people wanted to believe in. The Roaring Twenties needed a ghost, and Al Capone became its chosen one. There's a strange mercy in myth. It takes the edges off, it softens the cruelty, paints the violence with nostalgia, and replaces the blood with jazz. Somewhere between the truth and the telling, Capone stopped being a man entirely. He became a mirror. In him, people saw what they wanted to see: ambition, tragedy, rebellion, or ruin. But beneath the legend, the city still bore scars. Entire neighborhoods had been built on the money his empire laundered. Political dynasties had been shaped by his bribes. Police careers destroyed by his wrath. Even after he was gone, the old habits remained: corruption, hidden in plain sight; charm, masking fear. Chicago had learned from its king how to smile with a knife behind the back. Still, the people remembered the small things, too. The soup kitchens he funded during the Depression. The stories of him tipping paper boys, of sending gifts to families at Christmas. For every man he had ruined, there was another who swore he had saved them. Like all powerful men, his morality depended on where you were standing. As decades passed, the city changed, and his name became less dangerous to say. Bars used it for cocktails. Tour guides used it for charm. The Capone who once terrified Chicago now decorated postcards. He was history, but a friendly kind, the kind that sells tickets and stories. It's strange how easily terror fades when it's repackaged as entertainment. In truth, no one could decide who he truly was. A villain? A businessman? A victim of circumstance? The lines had blurred long ago. Perhaps he had been all of them. A man caught between hunger and history, who mistook control for peace. And when both vanished, all that was left was the echo. Time has a way of sanding down sharp edges. When people spoke of Al Capone in the decades that followed, they did so with a strange fondness, as though he had been a rogue character in a story, rather than a man who once made Chicago tremble. They said his name with a grin, not a shiver. And that was perhaps his final victory, to be remembered not for what he did, but for what people wanted him to have been. The movies helped seal that transformation. Every few years, a new Capone appeared on screen, some charming, some cruel, some almost saintly in their tragedy. He was reinvented, repackaged, made timeless. The man who once hid from cameras became immortal through them. The reel spun, the lights dimmed, and there he was again, laughing behind a cigar, larger than life, untouchable. But real immortality has nothing to do with fame. It lives in the quiet places, in the spaces where a name lingers without sound. Capone's ghost was not in the theaters, nor the postcards, nor the reenactments. It lived in the city itself, in the rhythm of its alleys, the tension in its politics, the unspoken understanding that power always hides beneath politeness. Sometimes, late at night, Police officers walking their beats would pass by old buildings rumored to be part of Capone's network. Basement doors sealed for decades, tunnels long since filled in. They'd pause, listen, and swear they could hear the faint echo of music or laughter or glass breaking. Of course, there was nothing there. Just the city breathing, remembering itself. Historians still argue about him. Some call him a necessary villain, a man who exposed the hypocrisy of prohibition, who showed that laws built on moral panic can only breed corruption. Others see him as a tyrant, a man who fed on fear and called it business. Perhaps both are true. History rarely grants the simplicity of good and evil. It only leaves behind echoes, and we choose which ones to hear. There is a photograph taken in the early 1930s of Capone smiling at a charity event. Children crowd around him holding boxes of food. His expression is almost gentle. For decades, people have debated whether that smile was genuine, whether the man who built an empire on fear could also feel compassion. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe it isn't about whether he meant it, but that he wanted to. Because beneath all the brutality, all the blood and business, was a simple human hunger to matter. Capone didn't want peace. He wanted permanence. And in that he was no different from the city he ruled, or the nation that both condemned and admired him. America has always had a soft spot for outlaws who wear good suits. As the years rolled into the late 20th century, his name became shorthand for power, the kind that feels thrilling to imagine but terrifying to meet. Restaurants were named after him. Whiskey bottles bore his face. Tour buses followed his footsteps, pausing at bullet-scarred walls, and underground bars turned into gift shops. The city sold his ghost, and the world kept buying. Yet, even in this glossy myth-making, a quieter truth survived. The story of Al Capone is not just about crime. It's about consequence. It's about what happens when a man believes that fear can build a kingdom, and how that kingdom inevitably collapses beneath its own weight. The silence that followed him wasn't punishment. It was gravity. Every empire becomes an echo. Every name, no matter how loud, eventually fades into the background hum of history. But some echoes linger longer, not because they are great, but because they are unresolved. Capone's echo endures not because he triumphed, but because he never truly understood what he was fighting for. Power without peace is just noise. And so the city continues to hum, the jazz long gone, the bootleggers buried, the river running clear. Somewhere in that hum, his name still drifts like smoke. Capone. Neither hero nor monster, just a man who tried to outlive time, and almost did. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is what remains after the noise has gone. The residue of echoes, the quiet space where meaning lingers. For Al Capone, silence became both punishment and peace. And for the world he left behind, it became the question that no one could quite answer. What happens to power when there is no one left to fear it? In Chicago, the silence came first as confusion, then nostalgia. The gunfire stopped. The bootleg trucks disappeared from the roads. The newspapers turned to other headlines, other villains. But in the quiet that followed, people began to realize something unsettling. The city felt emptier, not safer, as if the chaos had been keeping something alive.
For years, the city had defined itself against him. Now, with him gone, it struggled to remember what it had been before. The police lost their symbol of corruption. The papers lost their villain. The people lost their daily thrill of danger. Capone had been a mirror, and when he was gone, Chicago was forced to look at itself. Silence, for the first time, became the city's new language. Buildings stood like witnesses, their brickwork stained by the stories they had contained. Speakeasies turned into restaurants, hideouts into apartments, and the sound of laughter returned, softer this time, stripped of its desperation. Yet, in certain corners, under certain lights, people swore they could still feel it. That low, electric hum of the old days. Meanwhile, down in Florida, silence took on a different shape. For Capone, it was not the silence of absence, but of surrender. His final years had been a slow fading, a dissolving of the man into stillness. And in that stillness, perhaps he finally saw what the noise had hidden. It was not wealth he had chased, nor control, but quiet. Power, after all, is a fragile kind of music. It needs applause to exist and fear to echo. When both fall silent, the melody dies. Capone's empire was built on rhythm, the rhythm of deals, threats, and the gunfire that punctuated them. When that rhythm ended, there was only breath left, and the slow realization that silence was the truest kind of wealth he had never learned to keep. Historians like to measure lives in events, the raids, the arrests, the sentences. But the real story lives between those moments, in the pauses. Capone's pauses were few but telling. The moment before a meeting began, the breath before a sentence was spoken, the quiet gaze after a man had left the room. He lived in those gaps, the seconds where control and uncertainty danced together. After his death, silence became a kind of inheritance. Every gangster who came after him learned the lesson he never could: talk less, move quietly, hide behind respectability. His mistakes became their education. The underworld evolved, sleeker, smarter, faceless. The guns went quiet, but the greed stayed the same. There's a saying in old Chicago: you can kill the man, but you can't bury the noise. And yet somehow Capone managed to do just that. He turned the noise into silence, the legend into myth, and the myth into memory. Not by choice, perhaps, but by inevitability. Every man who builds an empire must one day hear what's left after it crumbles. Silence became his monument. Not marble or stone, not gold or glory, just the hush that comes when a life of noise finally stops echoing. It is said that if you walk the streets of Palm Island at dawn, before the tourists wake, you can hear it still. The faint rhythm of waves, the distant hum of a radio, and somewhere beneath it all, a single whisper. I did all right, didn't I? History rarely remembers the sound of footsteps leaving a room. It records only the shouting, the shots, the headlines, the noise that makes a legend. But the truest history, the one that lingers long after the lights fade, lives in the quiet, in the way a man exhales when no one is watching, in the way the ocean forgets every empire that ever called itself eternal. Silence, for Al Capone, was both an exile and a teacher. It stripped him of his myth, leaving only the man, the husband, the father, the child of Brooklyn who had once sold newspapers and dreamed of something bigger.
In those final years by the sea, he learned what the city could never teach him: that fear can build walls, but never homes; that loyalty built on profit is only a shadow of love; and that the world, in the end, forgets faster than it forgives. When his wife came into the room, she found him staring out toward the horizon, lost in the kind of thought that cannot be spoken. He had begun to speak softly now, sometimes to her, sometimes to no one at all. He would hum to himself fragments of jazz tunes from Chicago, bits of songs the boys once played in the back rooms of Cicero. The music wasn't sharp anymore. It was tender, uncertain, as if he were apologizing with each note. People often say he died forgotten, but that isn't quite true. He lived on in whispers, in stories told by bartenders who claimed to have seen him, by old policemen who swore they'd once chased him through the alleys. And in every retelling, the volume grew a little louder. The man became a myth again, as though the silence itself couldn't hold him. For history, this is how it always goes. We forget the blood, but remember the shadow. We rebuild the myths to make sense of what was senseless, and sometimes we even romanticize the monsters, because it's easier than facing what created them. Capone wasn't born from evil alone. He was born from hunger, from poverty, from a city that asked for cheap miracles and quick money. He simply gave it what it wanted, until the cost became unbearable. I often imagine his last days as a kind of confession without words. No priests, no courtroom, no witnesses, just the sea, endless, unjudging, vast enough to hold all the noise of a lifetime and still remain calm. Perhaps that was the final irony. The man who once ruled through noise would die in the arms of silence. There's a strange comfort in that, because for all his violence, all his cruelty, all his ambition, there was still something human left in him, fragile and unguarded. A part of him that longed for peace, even as he destroyed it. And perhaps, if we strip away the legend, the truth that remains is simple. He was a man who mistook fear for respect, noise for meaning, power for love. When the papers finally printed the headline, "Al Capone dead at 48, there was no uproar, just a kind of collective sigh. The world had already moved on to newer wars, newer fears. But in some quiet corners, people paused, not to mourn, not to celebrate, just to remember that the world had once been louder. And for a time, that noise had a name. And so the silence settled in for good. It filled the spaces he had once occupied, the clubs, the alleys, the back rooms, until they became ordinary again. The ghosts of laughter and gunfire faded, leaving only brick and dust. History folded him neatly into its pages, between emperors and tyrants, dreamers and fools. And there he stays, not as a hero, not as a villain, but as an echo, a man who lived too loudly and learned too late the cost of noise. The last line belongs not to him, but to the silence he left behind. It says nothing. It asks for nothing. It simply waits, as all silences do, for the next man who thinks the world will never forget his name. The years have grown soft around Chicago. The skyline is taller now, the streets cleaner, and the laughter comes from open windows rather than behind locked doors. But if you walk alone, early, before the first trains stir, before the cafes hum with morning, you can still hear it. that faint, lingering pulse beneath the city's skin, a rhythm that refuses to die. I sometimes walk past the old neighborhoods where the speakeasies once hid behind false doors and whispered passwords. There's a coffee shop now where the Lexington Hotel used to stand. Baristas greet tired commuters, unaware that beneath their feet once ran secret corridors filled with guns, liquor, and trembling men. The ghosts, I think, must be amused. The noise has become commerce again, but of a gentler kind. The hiss of espresso, the laughter of morning regulars. History, for all its blood, is good at disguises. Sometimes, in the stillness, I imagine him. Not the Capone of newsreels or courtroom sketches, but the quiet one, the man no one saw. A man standing in his shirt sleeves on a balcony somewhere, cigar forgotten between his fingers, eyes turned toward a city that both made and destroyed him. If ghosts dream, I think his must dream of that. The view of a city still breathing, still alive, long after his empire turned to dust. I passed the same alleys that once echoed with running footsteps and shouts. Now they're filled with murals, painted faces of musicians, poets, workers, children. Chicago no longer hides its noise, it celebrates it. The city learned to turn chaos into culture, violence into rhythm. And though no plaque bears his name, the shadow of Capone is woven into every streetlight, every jazz note, every story whispered after midnight. We like to think time erases, but it doesn't. It softens. It sands the edges, polishes the cruelty, and leaves behind something quieter, something almost kind. That's what history does best. It forgives, not by choice, but by fatigue. And yet, walking these streets, I realize that what remains isn't forgiveness, it's understanding. Every age has its Al Capone. Every generation breeds its own merchants of noise, men who mistake fear for power, chaos for control. They build their empires and watch them crumble, convinced they'll be the ones to escape the silence that waits beyond the echo. But the silence always wins. It doesn't rush, it simply waits. And yet, there is something almost merciful about that waiting. Because silence, unlike power, doesn't judge. It takes in everything, the good, the brutal, the foolish, and folds it into stillness. The same quiet that once haunted Capone now blankets the whole city, soft and enduring, humming beneath the traffic. It reminds us that history isn't just what happened. It's what remains when the noise is gone. Once this city was drunk on ambition. Now it has sobered. The banks where money once flowed like moonshine are offices and apartments now. The warehouses are galleries, and the men who once carried pistols carry cameras or guitars. Chicago didn't cleanse itself. It transformed. It learned that power built from fear collapses, but power built from memory endures. I stop near the river sometimes, where barges drift slowly under the bridges. The air smells of diesel and water, and for a brief moment, it feels the same as it must have a century ago. Capone's men used to use these docks, unloading barrels that glowed faintly with whiskey and risk. Now they unload crates of groceries, construction materials, coffee beans, different goods, same hunger. The city still feeds on movement. When I listen closely, I swear I can hear it. Not the gunfire, but the rhythm that came before it, the heartbeat heartbeat of the city that created him. Because Al Capone was never just one man. He was the noise of a generation trying to drown out its fear, the echo of the Great Depression, the laughter in a country that had forgotten how to hope. And when he fell silent, the country had to find a new sound to fill the void. Perhaps that is why he lingers, not as a warning, but as a mirror. He reminds us that beneath every story of greed lies a story of need, that behind every empire of crime is an empire of longing, and that the line between survival and sin is thinner than history likes to admit. The tourists who come here now, they don't see ghosts, they see legends. They buy postcards, pose by plaques, sip Capone cocktails in themed bars. The city sells its past because that's what cities do. But beneath the laughter, beneath the neon nostalgia, there's still that faint tremor of something older, a memory that refuses to be commodified. If you stand by the lakeshore just before sunset, the skyline glows like a confession. The glass towers shimmer, and for a moment they look like they might dissolve into light. It's then that I think of him again. Not the gangster, not the myth, but the man who once stared out at another horizon, realizing, perhaps too late, that noise had cost him peace. The sea had forgiven him, even if history never would. The city exhales as night falls. The lights flicker on, one by one. And in that glowing grid of gold and shadow, I can almost hear him again, not shouting, not laughing, not commanding, just breathing. Breathing through the city he helped shape, through the stories that still whisper his name in half-truths and cigarette smoke. Maybe that's what he always wanted. Not power, not glory, but to be remembered. Not by the world, but by the city. And in that way he succeeded. Because every hum of traffic, every flicker of neon, every beat of music in a downtown bar carries, however faintly, the rhythm of his time. The noise that once defined him has become the city's heartbeat, quieter, wiser, eternal. And as I turn away from the lake, the wind carrying the scent of the city's long memory, I understand at last what the silence meant. It was never emptiness. It was the pause after the final note, the moment the audience forgets to clap, the heartbeat of history itself, still pulsing beneath the surface, waiting for the next song to begin. A history told not through violence, but through the spaces between, through the silence that remains when the noise has finally stopped.